Thank you, one might even say. So I know I've got the coveted right before lunch spot. So we're going to make this a little interactive so you're not sitting there. We're running a few minutes ahead, so it's all fine. We'll start just a little quick introduction. I don't have a big resume slide or anything like that, but again, my name is Matty Stratton. I'm a DevOps advocate for PagerDuty. How many people here have heard of PagerDuty? So, okay. How many people love to hate us, right? So I always have to sort of mention PagerDuty. They pay my bills. That's why I'm here, and that's the end of it. We're not going to talk about PagerDuty as a product anymore. Another thing is that I organize DevOps Days Chicago. So I get to go to a lot of different DevOps Days. I'm really excited to be here, part of this one. This community is awesome. If you are intrigued by this notion of presenting, maybe DevOps Days Chicago CFP is still open for another couple weeks, so you might want to check that out at DevOpsDays.org. But we're going to talk about a little bit about chaos engineering today, and a little bit about the human factors and the people things to keep in mind. So along the lines of thinking about making this interactive, just what are some of the words and ideas you think of when I mention chaos engineering? Just shout some out. Game day. What else? What are some other words? Okay. So maybe we'll do a little bit more talk about what chaos engineering actually is. And speaking of chaos, clicker. Hey, woo, doo doo. Okay, so according to the internet, principlesofchaos.org, basically chaos engineering is this discipline of experimenting on a system, right? And we want to build confidence in the capability of that system to withstand turbulence. Okay, a little bit of background about where kind of chaos came from, and I know there's a lot of differences of opinions of kind of the etymology and the history. But when people first started being aware of chaos engineering was from this little media company you may have heard of called Netflix. And they had a product, a tool called Chaos Monkey. And what Chaos Monkey's intent was to kind of, I don't want to use the word randomly, but it would shut off services in production. And the intent was to create this need for almost defensive coding, right? Because the reality is you don't know, your systems are turbulent. So if you're saying, we're not just saying if, we're saying when. Now, the mechanism and kind of the methodology of chaos engineering has matured over the years, so it's not just about shutting things off anymore. It's really, the key word here is it's about experimenting. And before we talk a little bit more about what chaos engineering is, I want to spend a little time talking about what chaos engineering is not. And I've become very aware of, as was witnessed when I said, what are some words you think of? And I get crickets. When I post on social media and I look for feedback and thoughts around chaos engineering, I can definitely see that while in some circles people are very aware of it, some people are not. And one of the most common things that I hear when I'll post something and say, what do you think about chaos engineering? And people will say, isn't all engineering chaotic? And I'm like, that's not kind of what we're talking about, right? And it's not about the fact that engineering is chaotic. It's not about the fact that our processes are unpredictable. There's a lot of things, a lot of work we do that's somewhat unfortunately named. DevOps might be one of those terms. It was, not to go off on a tangent, but if you know the history around why we call DevOps DevOps, it's because Agile System Administration was too long of a name for a conference. And now we run into this thing where now we have to name things DevSec, Biz, DBOps, and everything because we take everything far too literally. So just why we don't take the word DevOps literally, we shouldn't necessarily take the term chaos engineering literally. So what are some other things it is not? So this is a really big one. And I asked some people, because I always go to others to get insights and influence. And I said, what's something that people need to know? What are some first principles? And one of my friends said, it's not about breaking things. And I said, that's so insightful that it's going on a slide by itself. So this is me not being a liar. I told Sylvia that I would put her tweet on a slide by itself. But chaos engineering is not about breaking things, right? It's not about trying to figure out how we can make things fail, right? What it's really about is about experimentation, right? So what we are intending to do is we're creating a hypothesis. We say we believe that if this certain thing happens, this is what's going to happen with our system. We believe that our system is resilient. We believe our system is reliable. Resiliency has to do with the human factors. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so what you don't want to do is we're not going in there and just saying, let's just turn things off. Let's just see how we can break shit, right? We actually have to have a hypothesis, because if you don't have a hypothesis, how do you know if you were right? How do you know what you have learned? We talk about, efficient and effective organizations or learning organizations. Chaos engineering is a great tool for helping us learn more. One of a common thing, working for PagerDuty, we talk about incidents a lot. There's a saying that incidents are a gift, right? We are unable, because we are humans, we are unable to talk to our systems directly. We have to communicate through some type of a proxy. So an incident is a way for our system to tell us something. What's nice is if we don't have to wait for an incident, right? If there's ways that we can encourage our systems to tell us things about themselves so that we can learn more. So we create hypotheses and then we test them out. And so we think about chaos experiments, right? Now, this is where things get a little tricky. Some people believe that to properly do chaos engineering, you must run your chaos experiments in production. I would much prefer to say, no pun intended, that experimenting in production is preferred, because as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, not every system is appropriate for production testing. Now, there's no testing like testing in prod, because no matter how good you think staging is not prod. You don't have things like the Googlebot crawling you in staging. You don't have, some random Blu-ray player from 6 years ago that's trying to run your client in staging. But testing in prod comes with risks. So how many people have heard when Charity Major says, nines don't matter if your users aren't happy, right? So if you haven't heard that, you just did. And the reason I bring this up is because we live in a world of scale, right? And so we understand, or we should, that chasing after 100% reliability is a fool's errand. Our systems are always in some state of degradation. So we sit there and we say, okay, what is the minimum acceptable uptime? And we tell ourselves, okay, you know what, 3 nines is good, 4 nines is good, that's fine. Well, you know what, there's still people at the other end of that 0.001. There's someone who's still trying to do a thing. So what we want to do is we're still optimizing for our minimum required uptime, but we want to think about what the impact is on those particular humans. And the reason that doesn't mean that we shouldn't experiment and test in production. It means we need to be equipped. Because here's the other thing. If you aren't running chaos experiments in production, I've got news for you. You are. They're just really crappy experiments and you don't know what they are. So the better control and the better understanding we can have, the more resilient our systems and our teams can become. You can't do any of this without good measurement. So my buddy Aaron is giving an Ignite talk, a little bit later today about observability. So if you're not familiar with observability, he'll tell you everything you need to know in 5 minutes and then you can become a super expert. But the reason is, again, we're doing experiments. We have to be able to understand the impact of what we're doing so that we can understand when we maybe need to pull back on the experiment. Maybe we've hit a gate that says this is too much because we have a hypothesis. Well, what happens when we prove our hypothesis false? Our hypothesis is that if we shut down this particular system, our circuit breaker will kick in and people will still be able to watch their movie. What happens if they stop being able to watch their movie? Do we sit there and say, well, I guess I was wrong? No, we need to be able to back that out. We need to be able to work around it. And this is why we need to have an understanding of what our systems are doing and what that user experience is like. So we talked about minimizing blast radius, and there's lots of different ways to do this. Canaries are a very, very good technique when you're looking at running chaos experiments. You're not going to necessarily run this experiment. Again, I said you're going to test in production. That doesn't mean you're going to run it against all of production. You want to have an understandable blast radius. And there's another way to think about blast radius is it's more about releasing, but it's still a way to kind of consider. If you look at the way that Microsoft releases software, they have this notion of rings. So when they start, so they're kind of concentric circles that start out when they're releasing something where first it's just being released basically to the people who worked on the product, right? Then they start to roll it out to other teams inside Microsoft, and eventually all of Microsoft, and eventually out to consumers. So what's happening is as they're learning more, as the software is being released, they're being able to kind of expand that blast radius. And you can do the same thing with your chaos experiments, right? Where you start out and say, maybe I'm going to run this experiment against 1% of production, because I don't really know anything yet. I only have the beginnings of an understanding of my hypothesis. Then I kind of roll that out and I say, okay, looks like I might have been right. Looks like we're okay. Let's test it a little bit more, and let's test it a little bit more. And what this is letting us do is that when we do have a scenario that's causing a degraded experience, we are minimizing the number of people who are being affected. And this is the core of all of this. We have to remember that we have users. We have people who use our product. And it's very easy at the scale that we're used to working at to start looking at just the ones and zeros of the matrix. And we start to see those numbers that sort of fall off the end of the cliff, and we're like, well, it's okay. It's an acceptable degradation. Someone's still sitting there having a bad day. So we want to be able to minimize that acceptable risk. There we go. So tools, we can't have a talk about DevOps without talking about tools. So there's lots of different tools that can help you with your chaos experiments. And speaking of introducing chaos, I realize there is a big error on this next bullet point, so don't take a picture of it. So there is the Netflix Simian Army, and it is not found at that URL. That is a good, helpful website, which is Theories of Chaos. But you can find the Simian Army on GitHub. And this is, again, so it's a collection of tools that Netflix uses for their chaos experiments. There's also a product company called Gremlin who is happy to sell you some tooling, but they also do have a free version of their tool when you're getting started just with some very simple experiments. And Gremlin has a lot of good art on their website around how to approach chaos. And then there's also the good old Chaos Toolkit, which these are all tools. Again, the point of this talk is not going to tell you how to do chaos, like how to do the block and tackle, but these are some places to get started to kind of look at what you can do with some of these things. So now I'm going to, before we kind of move on a little bit further, I'm curious, and again, I know it's right before lunch, so maybe our energy level's a little low, but think about this as practice for open spaces, right? How many people work in an organization that has some kind of formalized chaos engineering practice? Okay. How many people have maybe less formal chaos engineering practices? Maybe you're doing some type of failure injection, but not formal. Okay. This has been fairly, of the surveys that I've kind of have done, I'm seeing that it seems about right when it comes to those numbers. And when I talk about, how formalized they can be as simple as somebody had shouted out game days, right? So this is one of the ways at PagerDuty that we do chaos engineering is through something we call Failure Fridays. And Failure Fridays are, as their name implies, they occur on Friday. You don't have to do them on a Friday, but you lose out on the alliteration, and that's a lot less fun. And for us, we we run them as planned failure injection, and we actually do ours during business hours on Friday. And the reason, there's two reasons for this. One being, we don't have maintenance windows. There's no good time for PagerDuty to be offline. So that being said, if we're going to run planned failure injection, we'd rather run it during the day when people are in the office and everyone's around, rather than trying to introduce this failure at 2 in the morning when we have less control and less understanding. The other thing that's really key about our failure injection is we're running it this way because we're not trying to stress out the humans, right? What we're trying to do is understand our system. And one of the things that's become a little more formal with our practice, when we first started doing failure injection, it was very opt-in. And there are a lot of processes at PagerDuty that when we started them, it was like, okay, this is just a thing you can do. And everybody got really excited about it, and they would do that. And then over time, people stopped volunteering. And now it's becoming something that we're creating as a requirement for a certification for a feature. Your feature has to have gone through a Failure Friday every 180 days or something like that. And we're still kind of working on that. But you don't have to start, my point is you don't have to start with this formalized approach. Start with some way to test out something you want to know. There it is. But, wow. Whoa. Okay, so starting over. So my name is Matty Stratton. There we go. What about the people? This was supposed to be the big reveal, too, so I was act surprised. But what about the people, right? As I've talked before. So we sit there and we say, we understand, it's been proven that following these techniques will let us understand our systems better. It will cause us to build more reliable, more stable systems that help build more resiliency into our organizations and into our things. Great. That's good for all the computers and all the networks and all your Kubernetes and all that fun stuff. But what about the people? So they say, how does it make you feel to know that Netflix practices chaos engineering, right? So that's a thing. You've all experienced it. You just don't know it, right? And when I've asked people about this, it usually makes you feel actually pretty okay. You're like, okay, good. They know their system. I can, I'm not going to miss out on my streams per second and all those great things. Okay, but how does it make you feel, drama, about your bank doing it? Because think about this, if you're on Netflix and you're in that 0.001% of failure, you get that, we can't play this title right now, try again. Okay, well, maybe you get a little annoyed or anything like that. But what happens when you're in there and you're actually maybe trying to pay your credit card bill, you're trying to transfer money from one account to another? Does this mean that if you are a financial institution or something like that, that you should not practice these techniques? Absolutely not. In fact, they're very, very, very necessary. But when you know you're practicing these hypotheses, this is teaching your organization to learn how to fail gracefully, right? How to understand retries, how to do these things. But this is why you start small. This is why maybe for a system like this, you don't start testing in production because you aren't sure. This is true at PagerDuty. We have some systems that we don't run Failure Fridays on outside in a production scenario because we know they're not quite there yet. And that's actually something we learned. Part of the hypothesis is I have a hypothesis that I don't think this system is resilient. I'm proving this out by not actually doing Failure Friday, but we have to get to the point where we can. This was a really, okay. So I did ask, I said, if you discover a service you consume uses chaos engineering, how do you feel? And most people that I asked, and I did some other surveys as well, not just this one Twitter poll, the majority said it made them actually feel reassured. Some people still feel uneasy about it, but I found that for the most part, as a consumer, people still feel reassured. And then also internally, I did some surveys and asked and said, how does it make you feel to know that your team practices these things? So now with knowing what you know a little bit about chaos engineering, how would you answer this question? How many people would say it makes you feel reassured to know that a product you use follows these practices? How many of you might feel a little more uneasy knowing this? Okay, most people abstained. I'm telling you, it's almost lunchtime. It's okay. It's going to be fine. So, now the other thing is, when you're talking about introducing these, management can get nervous. We talked about unfortunate names for things. Turns out that C-suite people don't like the word chaos. They really don't like the word failure. So you might need to think a little bit about nomenclature. Education is very key. Experiments are a much better term. Now, sometimes you're going to use the terms that you're going to use, but think about the words and what they carry. So anytime we're talking about making transformative change, we might know, as DevOps professionals, as people who go to these conferences, as people who read all about this on the Twitters, we know what chaos engineering really means. Your CFO is just hearing, you want to change a whole bunch of shit randomly, right? Wait, you want to inject failure? So education and understanding is a very, very key part. And you may even need to kind of, when you think about the corporate culture of the organization you're in, you may need to change your nomenclature. And there is, just like so many other things, there's a mental shift. There's a philosophical shift that needs to happen to embrace and learn from these type of techniques. It's not just turning on Chaos Monkey. It's not just suddenly doing these things. You need to make an organizational, cultural change. Now, I'm sorry to say, you can't just like snap your fingers and say we're changing our culture. In fact, it's impossible to change culture. What you can change are behaviors. Behaviors influence culture. And how do you change behavior? Incentives. So when you're thinking about this philosophical change I'm telling you you have to make, we want to think about how are we incenting people and how can they be incented to participate and embrace this. But I really like this way of thinking about the philosophy. So so Cody said, you know, his organization's not fully using chaos engineering, but recently had some interesting failures because of interns, from interns experimenting. And he said he felt excitement. There was a new error that hadn't occurred before. Ian Coldwater also mentioned on Twitter a while ago and said, you want to really understand chaos and inject chaos, give junior developers more freedom to do things. Because here's what happens. Even if we're not saying because junior developers or interns like make lots of mistakes and they break a bunch of shit, so therefore we'll find stuff. But those of us who have been doing this a long while, we think a certain way. We've gotten stuck in thinking a certain way. When we think about people who are new to our team, new to our organization, those are great people to get involved in your chaos experiments because they are going to ask different kinds of questions. They're going to want to test things in a different way. Because the other thing, when you've been working on a system for a long time and it's been working, you kind of think it's probably pretty good. But you know what? You might have just been getting really lucky. So figuring out ways to continue to test these things and getting diverse and outside opinions from the team really help. And safety matters, right? So we talked about this, about minimizing your blast radius and about understanding the impact. So you go into these things with your eyes wide open. You think about what the impact is, and a couple really key perspectives when it comes to that are these. So first of all, know your conditions. When will you shut down your experiment? What is something that happens? So I'll give you, you're going to know what your key metrics are. Because you have lots of metrics, and there's certain things that are acceptable and certain things that aren't. To go back to the Netflix example, Netflix has one very key metric that is their bread and butter. Does anybody happen to know what that metric is? Just curious. Stream starts per second. That's the one. As far as Netflix is concerned, almost anything else in their system can be down, and that's okay. But if stream starts per second starts to drop, then they have a problem. So when they're running chaos experiments, when that is an abort condition for them. If that starts to drop, they're like, oh, pull the plug, go back, right? We're going to work around that. So know what is the one for you. and keep it somewhat simple. If you have a list of 12 to 15 different metrics, and if these all change, that's not an experiment anymore. That's way too much data. I don't care what your business is, you don't have 15 key most important metrics ever. Talked about this, if everything's a priority, nothing is. If everything's the very most important metric ever, then nothing matters. This isn't about causing stress on your people. So this comes up a lot in lots of different kinds of game days when people say, well, you know what, incidents and stuff are stressful, so we need to get people to practice under stressful situations. This is a really bad idea because, trust me, your folks are going to get plenty of practice under stressful situations. What we want to do is we want to be able to have as much information as possible. So you need to be very transparent. Do not run experiments without affected people knowing what's happening. Your on-call need to know what experiments are being run. Make sure your incident response team knows. Make sure your security team know. Be very, very transparent. This is not about trying to catch people and trick them, even with the best of intentions. And remember that when you're designing these experiments, again, not to hammer it home even more, there are humans at the other end of these numbers. Those humans can be your users. They can be people who are paying your company money for a service. They can be people, even if they aren't paying you money, they're trying to consume a service. They're trying to do a thing. And some of the other humans involved are your coworkers, those incident responders I referred to. The folks who are trying to do their job, and you are injecting some change. So remember and think about what those human factors might be. And wrap up with a final, good resource slide, because lots of other people have spoken some really great words, written some great words about this. So Nora Jones, who has recently joined Slack, but was at Netflix for a long time, has a great blog post called Chaos Engineering Traps. So when you want to kind of understand, again, it's sort of a list of things to watch out for as you're starting to do this kind of work. I talked a bit about how we do chaos injection at PagerDuty. We use a tool called Chaos Cat, which is unfortunately we have not been able to open source because it's very tied into just how we do work. But my coworker Eric Sigler wrote a great blog post about how we do that. And again, thinking about DevSecOps, so a company called Optum, which you might also know as United Health Group, they have a tool that they open source, which is amazing. There's a great story because it's the very first open source project from this company called Chaos Slinger, and it's about running chaos experiments related to security, not just to service availability. So I highly recommend checking that out if you're really kind of wanting to level up your chaos experiments. But with that, I'm hoping maybe we can have some conversations during the open spaces around your experiences, things you might want to learn. And thank you very much for your time. It's been a real honor and a privilege to be part of DevOps Days Baltimore. Thank you.